There is a community that practiced Judaism in the highlands of northern Ethiopia for at least 1,000 years, isolated from every other Jewish population on earth, following religious law preserved in an ancient liturgical language most other Jewish communities had never heard of, praying toward Jerusalem from villages scattered across the Amhara and Tigray regions long before anyone in Europe had heard the word diaspora applied to them. They call themselves Beta Israel, the House of Israel. Outsiders once called them falasha, a word meaning landless or exile, now widely considered a slur. And after more than 2 millennia of practicing a faith nobody around them shared, geneticists finally sequenced their genomes, expecting, reasonably, to find confirmation of what the community itself had always maintained. What they found instead was something considerably more complicated than a simple yes. The traditional account of Beta Israel origins, preserved in the community's own oral history and in Ethiopia's national origin epic, the Kebra Nagast, traces their ancestry to the biblical meeting between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and specifically to the descendants of their son Menelik, who, according to the legend, brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. A related and more specific claim identifies Beta Israel as descendants of the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, scattered from the northern kingdom more than 2,700 years ago. For the community itself, this wasn't presented as legend requiring outside verification. It was simply their history, practiced daily through kosher dietary law, Sabbath observance, and a priestly class, the Kohanim, functioning much as biblical texts described, all maintained in near-total isolation from the rabbinic Judaism that developed everywhere else in the Jewish world after the destruction of the Second Temple. This raises an obvious question for population genetics, one considerably more specific than the origin stories this channel usually investigates. Every other major Jewish diaspora population, Ashkenazi communities of Europe, Sephardi communities of the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa, Mizrahi communities across the Middle East, and even the geographically isolated Beta Israel of Western India has been genetically studied over the past 2 decades, and a consistent pattern has emerged. Despite centuries or millennia of separation and local intermarriage, these communities show genetic clustering that traces back to a shared Levantine origin, detectable even in populations that had been isolated from each other and from the Middle East itself for well over 1,000 years. If Beta Israel truly descended from ancient Israelites in the same way, the genome should, in principle, be able to find at least a trace of that same signature. Multiple genome-wide studies conducted between 2009 and 2020, most significantly work by Tishkoff and colleagues in 2009 and Behar and colleagues in 2010, examined this question directly, and the results did not match what the community's origin story would predict. Beta Israel genomes cluster closely with neighboring non-Jewish Ethiopian populations, specifically the Semitic-speaking Amhara and Tigrayan communities of the Ethiopian highlands, sharing far more genetic similarity with these groups than with any Jewish population outside Ethiopia. Mitochondrial DNA studies found that just over half of Beta Israel maternal lineages belong to haplogroup L, a lineage marker strongly associated with broader sub-Saharan African ancestry, essentially identical in frequency to what appears in surrounding highland Ethiopian populations. Compared to the tight, detectable Levantine genetic signature found across nearly every other Jewish diaspora community on Earth, Beta Israel looked, genetically, like an Ethiopian highland population that happened to practice Judaism, not like a population that had carried Israelite ancestry across 2,000 years of isolation. That alone would already be a significant finding, but it isn't the complete picture, and this is where the story resists a clean resolution. Layered within that predominantly Ethiopian genetic signature, researchers also detected a smaller component, roughly 1/5 of the total genome in some analyses, showing similarity to Middle Eastern and Semitic populations, a signal some researchers have linked to possible gene flow from the Levant, occurring approximately 3,000 years ago, a time frame that would align suggestively, though not conclusively, with the biblical period the community's own origin story describes. Whether that signal represents a genuine echo of ancient Israelite ancestry or the product of more recent historical contact, trade, and intermarriage with Semitic-speaking populations already present in the Ethiopian highlands well before any claimed Israelite migration, is a question the genetic data alone cannot settle. Scholars remain split. The historian James Quirin and others working from a similar framework argue Beta Israel most likely descended from local Ethiopian populations, specifically groups with connections to the Agor people, whose religious identity crystallized into a distinct form of Judaism sometime in the medieval period, centuries after the biblical era the community's oral tradition describes, shaped by contact with Christian and Jewish religious currents already circulating in the region rather than by direct migration from ancient Israel. Other researchers, working from the same genetic data, argue this framework underweights the specific dated Levantine signal and historical accounts describing Jewish communities in the region far earlier than the medieval conversion theory allows. Neither side has produced evidence decisive enough to end the disagreement, and it's worth being direct about that rather than pretending the science has settled a question it hasn't. What makes Beta Israel genuinely distinct from every other population this channel has profiled is that the uncertainty runs in the opposite direction from what usually happens. For the Garifuna, for the Sidis, for the Maroons of Suriname, genetic testing generally confirmed or specified an African origin story that had been dismissed, doubted, or underdocumented by outside historians. For Beta Israel, the genetic testing did something closer to the reverse. It complicated an internally confident, deeply practiced religious identity that the community itself had never treated as uncertain, replacing a single clear narrative with an unresolved scientific debate the community didn't ask for and largely didn't need, having sustained an unbroken religious tradition for centuries, regardless of what any laboratory eventually concluded about its deep origins. That unresolved genetic question collided directly with a very real, very consequential legal one beginning in the mid-20th century, when Beta Israel leaders began petitioning the State of Israel for recognition under the Law of Return, which grants automatic citizenship to Jewish immigrants. The question of whether Beta Israel counted as authentically Jewish became a matter of formal, rabbinical, and government debate rather than settled fact, a debate that dragged on for decades, even as the community's own religious practice had never wavered. In 1973, Israel's Sephardi chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, formally ruled that Beta Israel were descendants of the tribe of Dan and therefore Jewish, a ruling that opened the legal path toward mass immigration, though many arriving Ethiopian Jews were still required to undergo symbolic conversion rituals upon arrival, a requirement that many in the community experienced as an insult to a faith they had never abandoned or diluted. 2 extraordinary covert airlifts followed. Operation Moses in 1984 evacuated approximately 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel amid famine and civil conflict, and Operation Solomon in 1991 airlifted more than 14,000 people in a single 36-hour period as Ethiopia's government collapsed. These remain among the most dramatic mass migrations in modern Jewish history, and for many Ethiopian Jewish families, they represented the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old prayer recited at the end of every Passover Seder for 2 millennia, phrased as a hope for return to Jerusalem. What followed immigration, however, was not simple integration. Ethiopian Israelis have documented well-recorded experiences of discrimination within Israeli society, including a 1,996 scandal in which it was revealed that Israeli health authorities had administered the long-acting contraceptive Depo-Provera to Ethiopian Jewish women, in many cases without full informed consent, contributing to a documented sharp decline in Ethiopian Israeli birth rates that the Israeli government later formally acknowledged and apologized for. Ethiopian Israeli communities have also organized repeated protests against police violence and systemic discrimination, most visibly in large demonstrations in 2015, following documented incidents of police brutality against Ethiopian Israeli citizens, protests that drew national and international attention to disparities in policing, employment, and social integration facing a community that had, in the most literal legal sense, already won recognition as fully Jewish and fully Israeli. It's worth noting one more layer of complexity that scholars have raised, though it comes from a smaller and more contested body of research than the core admixture studies. Some historians examining Beta Israel social structure prior to the 20th century have documented that the community itself held domestic slaves, individuals brought from populations further south in Ethiopia and from what is now South Sudan, some of whom underwent Jewish conversion rituals despite not being fully accepted as Jewish by the Beta Israel families who held them. This detail complicates any simple narrative in either direction. It doesn't undermine the community's own long-standing religious identity, but it does suggest that whatever the deepest origins of Beta Israel turn out to be, the community's internal history, like most long-standing societies, contained its own hierarchies and exclusions that don't map neatly onto either the ancient Israelite migration story or the medieval conversion theory on their own. Genetic ancestry studies conducted on modern Beta Israel populations were not typically designed to separate out this specific historical layer, which means it remains, like so much else in this story, documented in written and oral history without a clear genetic confirmation either way. There is a particular kind of tension embedded in this history that doesn't resolve neatly. Beta Israel spent centuries maintaining an unbroken, self-sustained Jewish identity with no external validation and, by most accounts, no real internal doubt about its own authenticity. When that identity finally collided with modern nation-state bureaucracy and genetic science simultaneously, both systems responded with hesitation the community itself had never shown. The rabbinate debated their legal status for years before granting full recognition. The genome, when finally examined, offered an answer considerably more ambiguous than a simple confirmation, clustering the community with its African neighbors far more strongly than with the Jewish people. It had prayed alongside in spirit for 2,000 years without ever meeting them. And Israeli society, having formally accepted the community as unquestionably Jewish under law, still produced documented patterns of discrimination that suggested acceptance on paper moved considerably faster than acceptance in practice. What this case adds to the broader pattern this channel keeps encountering is a genuinely different variation on a familiar theme. Most of the communities profiled here carry a history that outside institutions failed to record, forcing genetics to reconstruct what documentation never captured. Beta Israel represents something closer to the opposite problem. A history the community recorded meticulously, through unbroken religious practice across roughly 100 generations, that outside science still cannot fully corroborate or refute, sitting suspended between a medieval conversion theory that fits most of the genetic evidence and an ancient migration tradition that a smaller but real genetic signal keeps leaving open as a possibility. Nobody can definitively close. Sometimes the gap this channel investigates isn't between memory and evidence. Sometimes it's between two forms of evidence that simply refuse to agree, leaving a community whose faith was never in question to wait indefinitely for a science that may never be able to answer the one question it wasn't actually asking about itself.